Everyone. I hope you had a good evening yesterday evening. You'll be pleased to know that your colleagues in the drafting group were hard at work for 2.5, 3 hours after the board meeting yesterday evening. But I think that was a very productive session, actually. And basically, we worked our way through all the various different comments and reflecting the comments that came up in the board meeting yesterday. So both with the conceptual framework, chapter 7 update, and also with property, plant and equipment, those I think we've worked those through sufficiently. Drafting group will have another quick look at those before those come back to you tomorrow. But I think now we should be in good shape for for voting on those on Friday morning. So the board as a whole will get those back for the collaboration time session on Thursday. So we're on track as far as that's concerned. So if we then move on, obviously today we've got the leases item first before we move into sustainability. So in terms of, unless there's anything I need to say, administrative items, no. Okay, so with that, I'll hand over to João just to introduce the topic, and then I think probably also to Lynn as task force chair. So João, to you first.
Thanks, Ian. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to the board members that are online in different time zones. So it's great to be here again in Toronto, having physical meetings as a new normal. So staff and the task force thought it would be useful at this time to have kind of a catch up of where we are and how we landed here. So we are in the phase 2 of the leases project. Phase 1 was concluded with approval of IPSASB 43. And we have the second milestone of this phase 2 after the publication of the RFI. We are now proposing to this board the approval of the exposure draft after that public consultation, and that exposure draft is exposure draft 84. So it's a kind of a major milestone almost towards the end of this long run 7 years project that we are already in. So, and I don't have anything more to add from my end. I don't know if Lynn wants to say a few words as task force chair. Thank you.
Thanks, João. So, like you say, you called it a brief history of the leases project. I think that was a bit optimistic. We've worked hard to look to implement the instructions and the remaining from the October check-in and the remaining issues to be considered. I think, we are recommending that we do approve ED 84. If there are comments that we received today, we'll look to process those so that we get into a position where hopefully we can approve. I guess we're keen to get something out there so that we can get comments back. And, it is an exposure draft, not a final pronouncement. So hence our recommendation today, but looking forward to the debate and discussion.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks again to the task force members for the work that's been put in to developing this and to addressing the comments. So, João, to you.
Thanks, Ian. So, jumping to the first agenda item, exposure draft 84 development 6.2.1. So, as we have noticed, staff brought the final issues for this board to consider for approval. So there aren't major technical issues to be discussed. There is only one minor clarification on one technical topic, and we'll go there in just a few minutes. So the first recommendation to the board is about the title of the exposure draft. So this has been kind of a standing item even within the task force, and we thought that it would be useful to leave it to the end because it is part of the communications package of this board on what are we proposing as a board to our constituents for them to comment. And so this is the title, Exposure Draft 84, Concessionary Leases and Right of Use Assets in Kind. We thought that basically translates the two types of transactions or arrangements that this exposure draft has proposals on accounting. So I'd like to hear views from the board on the title. Ian, floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. I know as a board we can have many debates over titles. Any disagreement with the proposed title for the ED? So I think we're fine with that, Joel.
Yeah. Thanks for the confirmation. The second topic, it's about a specific set of paragraphs on the basis for conclusions, and this is related to the last IPSASB's instruction. Before jumping into the text, I thought it would be useful just to invest a couple of minutes with the board on how we landed where we are here. So, and why is that? Because staff has been receiving similar comments offline, and I keep kind of repeating the same thing. So, in order for all of us to be on the same page, it is worthwhile to spend these couple of minutes. So, and it's about the initial measurement of the right of use asset in a concessionary lease and the right of use asset in kind in an arrangement that grants that right of use asset. So back in the June meeting, staff and the task force recommended this board to use fair value because it was consistent with our literature. And the IPSASB showed concern with the usage of fair value because that definition of fair value that we currently have will be replaced with a new definition of fair value, as you all know, which has a concept of highest and best use. But the board was happy with the recommendation that the subsidy should be recognized, but using a different way to do that. And instructed staff and the task force to find a solution. And back in September, so staff and the task force over the summer discussed this, and in September, the solution that was proposed to the board was to use a measurement technique, which is the present value of lease payments at market rates. Because it is already consistent with IPSAS 43, because IPSAS 43 already applies this technique for concessionary leasebacks. So we would be just expanding that usage not only for concessionary leasebacks, but for all concessionary leases, basically in terms of the right of use assets. And would allow us also to address the other concern from the board, which is, okay, then we are then requiring not to use the highest and best use, but to require that preparers apply the current use of the asset. So by using a technique, a measurement technique, we could bring the current use without breaking the principles of the fair value definition that the board was also concerned. However, the board discussed this also in the October meeting and instructed staff and the task force to develop the basis for conclusions and the rationale on this. And that's where we have now those VCs explaining both things. So I just want to make clear to the board that this proposal is not something new or against the principles of IPSAS 43. No, we are basically expanding what we already have to other types of arrangements based with the leases at below market terms. But we can use still the present value of market lease payments without the current use. If the board wants to retain pure faithful to the principle of IPSAS 43, we can use it without the current use. But the board was really concerned about requiring highest and best use for everything. That's why we are now with current use as a requirement. And the BC's 127 explains the first part of that present value of lease payments at market rates, and 128, 29, and 30 explain the current use rationale. And with this, I'll ask the board if we have captured well in the BCs, the IPSASB's thinking on this topic. Thank you for your time, for this long explanation.
Thanks, João. I think it's helpful to have the background there. So open up for comments from board members on those BCs. Todd, lead us off, please.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, João. Looking at what we've got now, market value based on existing use, that is, I think, something that's quite a different concept for people to wrap their heads around. So we've got market value type approaches or techniques when you look at the measurement that we discussed the other day. And I think sort of adding the existing use could be a bit confusing for constituents. Is it a halfway house between fair value and COV? So given where we've now landed on measurement, I'm starting to question whether that actually makes sense and what constituents are going to make of it. Have we engaged with any valuers about how they would consider market value based on the existing way that the asset is used? I'd be interested to know whether we have engaged in terms of what that term might mean.
Dave, do you want to? So I think, Dave, you have had, a conversation, but I think part of the challenge actually is the fact that the valuers are still thinking through the implications of where we're going on COV. So that is one of the challenges, I think, isn't it, Dave?
Well, I was just going to highlight that João and I did have a conversation with an individual who works in the Ministry of Defense, and it was interesting. He had to do a lot of measuring assets that aren't available in active markets, and he walked João and I through his process to value the right of use asset because he's applying IFRS 16 right now. And we didn't specifically go into the exact wording that João was proposing, but he walked us through the mechanisms, and I'll let João comment on this, but it sounded consistent to me with what is being proposed.
Yes, it was not with valuers, but it was with accountants that are trying to value this. The approach they are doing, it's similar to what we are proposing, because what we are proposing here is to measure the rights associated with the lease, and the rights associated with the lease can best be captured by assessing leases in the market that are done by the same lessor or by the lessee in other assets that are similar in the nature. But they have gone, so the principle is the same, but they have gone a little bit further than this, because they have gone also to the whole asset itself, and as if to buy the asset, how much it would cost. Yes, kind of depreciated replacement cost. So they've gone a little bit further than what we are, and we explained that this approach is more consistent with the principles of IFRS 16 and IPSASB 43. And why is that? Because what we are trying always to measure is the rights associated to the lease and not the rights associated to the underlying asset itself. And there was this difference and also one commonality. So,
I mean, I think part of the challenge we face here is that this is an evolving area. And, I do wonder whether in this case that a sort of less is more type approach may be the right way to go on this, at least for now, because the more detailed we get in explanation here, I think we probably, end up tying ourselves in knots a bit, whereas maybe if we just walk it back a bit, that might actually help everyone. Anyway, Ross, you want to come in on that?
Well, just to kind of remind that this is an exposure draft, and these are the BCs that reflect the board's decisions to date. I think it's time to go out and ask the question to constituents and see what they think, rather than us continue to deliberate this point. So I can appreciate that. I think we should get the wording right in the basis for conclusion that captures the decisions made by the board in June and September on this. And then let's get it out and hear what people think.
So I'd back on that.
Yeah, I think I still have a concern here. If we can't be clear with our constituents how we expect them to go about measuring what we're asking here, how are they going to know? If we aren't being clear with them about what is market value on existing use, which is something different than what we've talked about in measurement to date, how are we going to expect them to engage with this exposure draft and understand what they're required to do? I do have a concern around that. And I think it's a legitimate concern if we can't explain it or we haven't got clarity ourselves about what this means and how they might go about getting this type of measure. Because market value, I think everyone can get their head around market value. Let's look at what's going on in the market, and it might be highest and best use when you go to the market. But what adjustments are we expecting them to make to get to market value on an existing use? And that's where I'm not clear. And if we can't be clear with our constituents what that is it more aligned with COV? Because that is another issue that I did have when I looked through this, having gone through measurement. If you're holding stuff for financial capacity, we've got fair value, operational capacity, COV. So operational capacity is something different. Some of these arrangements that we're now putting in through this exposure draft are going to be more at the operational level as opposed to at the financial capacity type level. And again, having gone out with this narrative about that through measurement, we're not actually reflecting it through what we're doing here, unless market value on existing use is trying to do that. But I'm not clear that that's what it's doing. And I think we need to be able to be clear with our constituents.
I mean, I think it's the question in my mind is actually, do we need to tie it to market value in existing use? Because actually what you're saying, Todd, around COV is actually essentially there. Now, there is an overlay on those discussions, which is existing use value is something that is present in the UK. So if you kind of take that lens off it, actually, and I think that's the kind of question that is that integral to the approach that has been asked, has been arrived at, or is it just in the way that we've described it? And maybe we just need to describe it as a market value approach. I don't know. So can I just ask for clarification before we proceed down this slope?
Yes, thanks, Tom. Yes, those have been the concerns that we have been receiving. So there are several options that this board can have. The first one, from one side of the spectrum, is to drop the current use as a requirement and leave it pure as we have it already in IPSASB 43. Because in IPSASB 43, this terminology of present value of lease at market rate is already used in concessionary leasebacks, and there is no identified issues from the private sector that already applies IFRS 16 and for early adopters of IPSASB 43, and that is one option. The other option is to address the concern that to recognize at initial measurement concessionary leases at highest and best use, difficulties and practicalities associated with that is to retain the proposal that we have here, which is current use. But by doing that, raises other issues that Todd has already raised, confusion with COV, and further explanations that we currently don't have in IPSASB 43. And perhaps we will need the measurement standard to help us to understand what the current use is. And further guidance might be needed even in our proposals, as Todd quite rightly said. So having heard this discussion, staff would be happy to drop the current use as a proposal without having still discussed with the task force. If that would be the solution that the board wants, just leave it with what we have in IPSASB 43, which is present value of market lease payments at, and that would be all. But once again, this is not an optimal solution because there is also disadvantages by doing that. So I would say it's up to the board to decide, weighing the advantages and disadvantages of each option, the way to go. Thank you.
So and then I'm going to take a couple more comments before coming back. I mean, I suppose in my mind, I'm just sort of, I was kind of looking at, well, what does it say in IPSAS 43 generically before the specifics, and if I'm just thinking normally, it gives guidance on initial measurement, and then subsequently it says you can use the approach consistently with the other assets in that class, etc. So in our terms, thinking on the discussion we had yesterday, that could be either COV or it could be fair value, and I guess that kind of comes then depending on where I go with that. So I'm not trying to unpick it at all, but I'm just trying to take this step back in terms of how specific do we need to be here, because it seems by trying to be more specific here, we're actually sort of tying ourselves up. Lynn, I might just go to you first as Task Force Chair, because I don't want to repeat discussions you've already had, and then I'll take comments from Lindy and Renee who are waiting.
So we did discuss this previously and agreed on this principle. All the task force has done is implement the previous decision of the board. So we did have the debate about whether or not we wanted current use in there, and I thought that the board had made a decision on that. I do accept that that decision was made before we finally got to a COV point. However, as we heard yesterday, we haven't then taken where we've now got on COV and tried to apply that across different standards. I think if we did, there could be an argument that says that the present value of lease payments at market rate based on current use might be COV for operational right of use assets. I think there could be a good case that would be where we would land in any case. So I guess I would be obviously biased and say, why wouldn't we expose this to see how that lands as part of informing a future piece of work that is planned as agreed yesterday about how COV may apply to different assets, including right of use assets. But we did discuss whether or not to have the current use in when we made the decision on it.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's very happy. Ross, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, just to support where Lynn's landed on this in terms of going out to our constituents. Excuse me. So if we approve this ED now, we're not going to have the measurement guidance approved till March at the earliest. It's probably not going to be even published till May or June. We'll already have the responses back from this by probably April if we get it out in early January. And we've already, staff will bring a plan on Friday talking about what I call the application of COV aspects of the measurement project. That work is going to have to continue after we finalize the measurement standard. So being informed by what we hear from leases, that would be good input for that phase of the project, where we look at taking the principle the board's going to agree in March and how they're applied in the other types of transactions that we haven't explicitly considered yet. So I think this is a good approach in terms of getting things moving and getting feedback from our constituents to help inform that.
Thanks, Ross. So then the proposal would be that perhaps we sort of modify the BCs just to actually get that sense into that's the approach that we're taking. Because I think that would certainly help, and I accept there's a bit of grayness in that, but it's an evolving area, and I think that would help sort of underline the fact that we're open for feedback on this, and it's part of that ongoing process. So with that, perhaps as a sort of way forward, Linda, you've been waiting patiently, as has Renee.
Yeah, I do have comment on this issue. So I think the reason why my understanding, the reason why we retained the fair value definition pre-IFRS 13 for leases is that when you measured the consideration or the right to use asset, you disregarded the highest and best use because you were just looking at the existing assets. So I think what we are saying here is not introducing COV, we are just clarifying that you're using fair value and disregarding highest and best use. So maybe that's the alternative way of saying it, because it might then create confusion that we're bringing another measurement technique. We're using exactly the same techniques. We're just saying when you're applying fair value, you're disregarding highest and best use.
Thanks, Lindy. Renee?
Yes, thank you. So my thinking is along the same lines. From a principles perspective, I didn't have an issue with this. Looking to a market rate for an asset in its current use feels very much like this principles underlying the COV under the market approach. And I felt very comfortable that we were using consistent principles. We're not using COV, but we're applying very similar principles. And that's been articulated under the market approach under the COV. So there, maybe it's an issue about better articulating what the principle is and referring to or inspiring ourselves on a way that we've done it under the COV market approach.
Thanks. So, I mean, Lynn, back to you on that.
I think we can probably do both, right? Because I think I take Lindy's point that when we wanted to be consistent with, in effect, IFRS 16, that didn't take the IFRS 13 definition of fair value. That's where we started on this journey. But actually, as COV has then developed, one might argue you end up in that place on COV, don't know, haven't done the work yet. But either way, you know, you could get it from either way, and maybe we need to explain both in the BCs as to why we therefore thought this was the right thing to expose.
Thanks, Lynn. I mean, that does start to feel like a way forward on this, that, you know, that acknowledges, you know, the emerging, you know, and ongoing work, as it were. Patricia, did you want to come in?
Yes, my concern is change the assumptions of some measurement basis. Because I think we need to think about the decision in a broad context, in the context of measurement project, in CF, conceptual framework project. In my view, the suggestion of Renee is better, because I use consistently the same principles related to the measurement basis. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. I think that, you know, that kind of approach of explaining, I think is helpful. And it, as has been said, I think it's important to get our thinking out there on this issue, but to acknowledge that we are really seeking feedback from constituents, and it may well be and we'll come on shortly to discuss the SMCs. It may well be that we can actually, you know, add some more open question there about, you know, what would be required, you know, what additional supporting implementation guidance, you know, would be required to implement. So it opens it up more as a dialogue. Todd, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just reflecting on what Patricia was saying. If we were talking about market value under COV in the document, that would be quite specific, and I think would eliminate some of the concerns, because if you are leasing an asset where you have to fall into the cost basis, well, you can't get a market value under COV, and so you're probably going to be at the cash flows that are associated with the underlying arrangement. I think that, in my mind, would start to make sense in terms of where we've got to on measurement. So agree, linking it to COV market value makes a lot more sense now although I acknowledge that measurement won't be out there, but
Yeah,
it's
it does come back to that comment I made right up front yesterday about the fact that we've got all of these sort of interrelated projects and we're trying to move them all forward, but we get all of these. Ross, you want to come in and then I'll go back to Lynn.
Yeah, I just want to come in on that because I do think to the point you're talking about the risk, unless the board's going to approve measurement this week, we don't have COV in our literature. So we can't refer to it in an ED and we shouldn't be repeating all the things that are coming in measurement now. So that's why I think what we've got now works. And we are going to get responses on this and measurement will be complete by that time and we'll make changes. But if we keep everything open until everything's done, we'll be sitting here at this time next year approving all of this stuff and we won't make any progress. And there's a bunch of projects that are sitting there in the queue waiting to start. I think this is not perfect, but this is the approach I think we have to take to move forward the discussion in this area and finish off measurement. But we're going to keep picking at it.
Yeah. So Lynn, and then I'll sum up on where I think we've got to.
So a couple of observations. I was just, first observation is we need to be careful that we are not making an assumption that all concession releases are held for operational capacity. So I am reluctant to suddenly start talking about COV, but I think what you've said on that, Ross, is important as well. And the other thing is around, managing constituents' expectations. We called it a brief history of the leases project, but actually the bit of the leases project that our constituents really want is to understand how to account for concession releases. And I do think it's important to get something out on that.
So, I mean, just sort of where we get to then, I think is we will need to get a sense of, where we are on that we've worked this through, I think, in the ways that have been explained. So that needs to be there. Then obviously we need to reflect the fact that, our thinking has been developing in parallel in terms of measurement. And, that's just a fact, really. Then I think that sort of, it needs to be further explored because our thinking on measurement COV has actually been developing in the context of property, plants and equipment. So therefore there is further work. So we can kind of couch it in that. And I think that probably bridges between, being totally explicit that we actually think it should be COV market value at this stage. So it allows us to get the debate out there, I think, if we're clear about that. We can make sure that we ask the right questions in SMCs in a way that directs people to that as an area that does require further comments and open it up a bit then in terms of the feedback, if that's okay. I mean, obviously, that's something that we need the task force then to go away and just have a look at how that's expressed, and it's partly contingent on what Ross has said in terms of how we formulate the kind of further implementation work across the standards. So with that as a way forward, Ajay, sorry, I hadn't brought you in. Do you want to add to that?
Oh, yes. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I was wondering, normally when a concessionary lease is granted, a particular use may be identified at the time the concession is granted. And if we consider in case a particular concession has been given for a particular use, for that asset to be used in a particular way, then a market value could probably be considered for that use. So, but if the asset will be granted without any particular use identified, then probably they could have a general market price for the right of use of that asset. I don't know whether that would solve the problem, if we can identify it in that manner.
I mean, I think, that those examples are useful to consider, but I think that probably is what we need to take into the further work, actually. So I think that's probably, you know, we don't want to get too far ahead. And I think one of the challenges we have in any case is that I do think the valuation profession is still getting its head around this as well. And to some extent, actually, where they're going actually needs to be informed by where we're thinking. But then the converse is true, and you need some use cases like the ones you've identified, really, to sort of make sure it's all done consistently. But we give the direction without them, you know, getting into the detail of what they do in practice. So I think, you know, we log those cases, and if everyone's okay, I think we've got a way forward on this. So move us on then, João.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks to the board for this very helpful discussion and on the way forward. So staff will work with the relevant board members that express the views, just to make sure that we have the wording right according to the idea that it was expressed by them. So please stay tuned for my contact. The other point for the recommendation to this board is about the specific matters for comment, as Ian has already alluded to. So perhaps according to this latest decision, I would like to guide the board to the SMCs that are in page 3 and 4 of the exposure draft, and please make those comments already in light of this latest discussion that we had and where we landed. So perhaps we can go by order with SMC1 and start from there, Ian. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, João. So we're looking at the SMC1, which is on page 3 of the document, just page 14 of the board paper. So Lindy, you were first in.
Thank you. So SMC1 says we've introduced new accounting. Do you agree? And then 2 and 3 and 4 are specific questions about the new accounting. So I just wondered if one would actually, if someone answers 1, aren't they answering 3 and 4 as well? So I thought maybe it should come out, or maybe there's something specific you want to ask around, should we have done it? But I think you're going to get the same answer.
Yes, good point, Lindy. So just for you to understand the rationale why we did this, is that normally we always have a generic question on the whole ED, and then we go to a specific point where the board wants to really capture a specific issue. Of course, with this approach that we have been taking, not only in this ED, but in previous EDs, we always run the risk of them repeating. But so far we have been successful by doing this, because we can also capture other points in the generic SMC1, basically, that it is its objective.
Perhaps then one should be, well, we've only identified accounting for concessionary leases and right of use assets. Do you agree that it's only these ones that should be addressed, or something like that?
Thanks, Lindy. It's helpful. Any other comments on SMC1? Okay, so we move on to SMC2 then. Okay, SMC3. Yeah, Lindy. Oh, and Patricia as well. I think.
I suppose my question is less on the question, but on, I suppose it's on the question, but also the text. I think the text doesn't limit the use of just the present value of the contractual payments to specialized assets. There's inconsistency. So I don't know what it is. Is it specialized assets, or is it just any assets?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. We have received also a similar comment through the editorials. So we have already a proposal to make sure that it's not only about specialized assets, as it is, how they say, understood by so a specialized asset is just an example, but can be also applicable to others. So actually, we already have a draft, redrafted version of this question precisely to address that point. And thanks, Lindy, for. And also impacts also in 4. So it's the same thing in 4. And we already have something. So please stay tuned for the revised version.
Okay. Thanks, Lindy. And I think that does exemplify that. I think what increasingly members and TAs have been doing is actually providing comments ahead of the meeting to staff. And I just underline how helpful that is, because obviously it allows staff time to react and to, move things forward in the meeting. Patricia.
Thank you. My question here is the contractual payment values to measure the right of use on assets. And in accordance with the discussion yesterday, when the historical cost is not does not faithfully represent the value of an asset, the entity should use another measurement basis. In the beginning of our discussion about how to measure the concessionary leases, the main factor is that the contract payment is not representative of the value of the assets. Is the motivation for having another basis of measurement. And then in the ED, there is the ED allows the entity to measure the assets based on the contractual payments. For me, it's so confusing. Because if I need to have another basis, because the contractual payment is not faithfully represents the value of an asset. And initially, I disagree with the appointment because of the relationship with conceptual framework and other decisions. For example, heritage assets, the board decides that not recognized for a value that not represent the value of the heritage asset. It's my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I think this is another manifestation of the challenge we've got in terms of, if you like, making sure that we can work through all the various different public sector situations, which weren't envisaged when ISB actually developed IFRS 16. And I think that's where, if you like, if you go back to IPSASB 43, we've got the basic approach that, you recognise initially at the value of the lease payments, and then you've got the option of moving to some form of current value subsequently. And that's just a generic reference at the moment, and it's an option. And I think that's where it kind of, we've got to sort of, there's some further working through against where we get to on measurement, bearing in mind also we've developed the thinking at this meeting, for example, on deemed cost and so on. So there's a number of different things that I think we, are challenged on here that we should, I think, back to Lynn's point, actually, we've done some thinking here and there are some principles at a high level that we want to get feedback on. Lynn?
Yeah, so I do have sympathy with what you're saying, Patricia. We have said that on a concession release, you should try to get to a present value of market lease payments, because we do think that would be more fairly representative of the asset value. I guess you're then in the question of how hard do you try to get that value? And we're saying there has to be, in effect, a fallback position. Now, I think that when we expose this, we will get a feel for whether or not our constituents feel that actually there'll be always back in the fallback position of the contractual payments, or whether or not it will be possible to get the values that we hope they will be able to by asking them to do the present value of the market value of the lease payments. So I think, again, it's one of those that, we haven't mandated you must. We've given a fallback position that if you absolutely can't, then you would revert to the contractual payments. It's not, it's not ideal. You might want to mandate that you must, and that might be the feedback that we might get, or we might get feedback that actually you need to go to a different fallback position than the contractual payments. At the moment, the task force didn't think of an alternative position, so therefore we've gone with the approach that we've put out there. We could ask an SMC specifically about that, if we think that would be helpful, about the fact that if you can't get the market value, we've reverted to contractual payments. Is that appropriate? Is a different value, should a different value be considered at that point? We could ask an SMC on it.
Patricia, back on that.
Yes, I agree with you, but I think one justification could maybe present, because in specific about the concessional leases, the liability is measured in faithful way. I think it's a justification to have different decision in relation, for example, heritage assets, because the liability is measured in a consistent way or in a faithful way. Yes, and but I think it's necessary to have a specific requirement about disclosure. What the concessional lease that was measured based on payments at market rates, and the concessional lease that was measured based on the contractual base. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. So, I mean, I think clearly we've got an instruction there from the board in terms of the additional SMC. I wonder whether we aren't going to want perhaps a bit more on BCs that would link with that, which would sort of pick up some of the thinking behind what you've been saying there, Patricia. Does that make sense? So I think if we have that as an instruction for the task force, and then obviously you need to draw, when you've had to think about it, draw Patricia into that to make sure it picks up the sense of what she said. Lindy.
So different comment. I was wondering if we do need a SMC on the lessor accounting, and that we didn't do anything about it, or we didn't remeasure the payments, and just ask, because there's a lot of BCs in there, and perhaps we want to direct them to it or ask a specific question on it.
Sure.
So the objective of SMC2 was that, but I'm not sure if it captured what you ask, or if we need more. Because SMC2 is about the lessor, is for lessor. But is it enough, or are you envisaging more? Okay, thank you.
Okay. That's helpful. Okay, so anything else we want to pick up then in terms of SMCs? I think it's clear those are going to be very important. Camira.
Thanks, Chair. Just a minor comment. I just noticed that we changed a bit the wording of the questions at the end. Now we are asking the constituents to provide also additional reasons not already discussing the basis for conclusions in case they agree. I was wondering why is it necessary, because it's additional workload for also respondents. Thanks.
Thanks, Camira. I think it sort of, we always have this sort of debate about, do we have a standardized way of drafting SMCs, and they always seem to evolve. Ross.
Yeah, we've used different iterations of this at the end of a question before. The reason we asked this is because we just don't want a yes or a no. And if we've put the time in the BCs that puts the board's thinking in, if people don't agree with that or agree for different reasons, it's really helpful to get that richness in the comment letter. That's where the real value of the comment letters come. So I think we should leave that in if we want to look to standardize that with a past exposure draft. That's fine, but I would caution against taking that out.
So, but just check the wording to make sure it is entirely standard with, because I agree with you. I think it is. That's where the value comes. And you're right, Camira. It does, but it means that they actually need to go. Yes, actually, why do I think that way? And that's what's important for us. Okay. So with that, did you just want to walk through the document, João, to sort of
so the last point is thanks the board for the guidance for the SMCs. So just to explain the board the process that staff task force did with these editorials. So we've accepted all the editorials from the last version. So the new, the markup that we have here, it's the version between October and December. Meanwhile, as Ian already alluded to, we have received several suggestions in terms of editorials, changes from AGs to core text, but not changing the principles, changing wording of the BCs, putting some paragraphs also. So, but of course, staff assessed didn't identify any reason not to accept, because it is according to the principle that the board have agreed so far with this. So staff is planning to bring also those suggested amendments for the board's review on Friday. And with this, I'll take any major points that the board might have, and please send me through the ones that I haven't received any more suggested editorials. And that is all, Ian. Thank you.
I mean, do you want to walk through on a page by page just to, I mean,
we can, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe if we just look at the first page 17 of 67 in your board papers, which is the objective, and then we've got the request for comments if there's anything there. And then we move into the amendments to IPSASB 43, which is page 7 of the document. If we move into page 8. Yeah, Lindy.
Thank you. I actually, just looking at it, wondered if we needed 26C. So that talks about subsequent measurement for this right to use asset, but there is a general paragraph in the current ED standard, which pretty much says the same thing. So I don't know if you need something specific for, because it's the same. So I thought to delete it.
Sorry, that was one of the suggestions that we had, because we are not here saying new things. It is basically saying the same thing that we already have for every right of use asset. And one of the suggestions was precisely to drop this, and staff would be happy. So with your suggestion, and if the board agrees, we'll do that.
Does anybody object to deletion? That's 26C, you're saying?
Yes.
So we're okay with that deletion? Okay. Todd.
Wasn't quite sure when to raise this, but I think it comes up in the underlying standard around this sort of area, and it's comments that have been shared with staff. But when it comes to modifications or reassessments and those sorts of things required because of changes made in the arrangements, I think it gets quite a lot more complicated when you're dealing with a concessionary lease than a typical lease. And I am concerned that without the right level of guidance in what we do here, you could get quite different outcomes depending on how people interpret what's there at present. So I think we need to address that issue to ensure we don't get unintended outcomes.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. So staff has already a kind of a proposal, and we have been working with New Zealand, so to bring that also for Friday.
Okay. Okay, thanks. If I might make a comment, just one thing that I picked up on actually having had the discussion yesterday was actually about the use of the term cost, because we've been going around that on property, plant and equipment, and you may tell me that actually that's consistent with what IPSAS 43 uses, but I just thought that might be worth just having a further think about that. You may not be able to do anything about it, and it's not a huge point, but I just thought I'd log it if that's okay, and I won't die in a ditch over that one. Lynn, did you want to come back on that?
Well, just on that, it's going to be throughout IPSAS 43, and all we've done is pick up paragraphs here. So I would be reluctant to change just these paragraphs for it if it's elsewhere in IPSAS 43, which it is. So
yeah, okay, fair enough. I mean, that may come into further work that we do anyway.
Yeah, and maybe that comes at a future phase after measurements approved. I don't know.
Okay, no, I raised it tentatively based on the discussion we had last night. Okay. So let's move on to page 9. Oh, sorry, Patricia. Sorry, your flag's sort of behind the camera, so I can. Now I can see it.
And thank you. I would like to confirm if the initial measurement will be only the lease payment based on at market rate, or lease payment based on market rate and the initial costs and an estimate of cost to be incurred by the lessee in dismantling and removing. Because in the in paragraph 26B, in the estimate, in accordance with this paragraph, the value of the right of use on assets is composed of the lease payments at market rates and the initial direct cost incurred and estimate of cost to be incurred by lessee in dismantling and removing the underlying asset, because include 25C and 25B. Yeah, it is related with the, I think, with the question raised by Ian, the use of historical cost, or only the payments at because in some places in the document the term used is costs, in some places only the payments. I think it's confirm what is the criterion is, and then to use the same term consistently in EG 84. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, for raising that. We did discuss this. So what we are proposing here, it's nothing new in the sense that we already have this situation occurring with current IPSAS 43 with the concessionary leasebacks, and how the mechanics of the standard works is we have the main guidance in the paragraphs of concessionary leasebacks, which only talks about present value of market lease payments, because that's where they want to compare and contrast with contractual lease payments. But then that is not enough, because then for them to really measure the right of use asset, then they need to use the mechanics of the standard, which is to come ahead or above to the initial measurement and assess in particular what are all the elements that need to be included in the measurement of the right of use asset. And in this case, paragraph 25 says that it is not only the contractual lease payment, but also initial direct costs for dismantling, because normally those are not included in the lease payments measurement. So And this is how the mechanics of the standard is used. And what the staff and task force did, okay, let's use the same approach with concessionary leases in general, because we don't want to break, let's say, the philosophy of how the standard works for people to apply the standard.
Do we need to add some explanation on that? Sorry, Lynn.
Sorry, we actually say that in 26B, don't we? We actually say to do that in 26B. So I think it is there.
Yeah.
Because paragraphs 25C and D are those dismantling costs and the like.
No problem.
Okay. Okay, fine. Are we okay?
It's going to be paragraph 25 and 43, because that's what it's referring to. So these are just the amendments that are going into 43. So you still have to apply the rest of 43. So in 25(6)B, it refers to 25 that has all the points that we're talking about that Joao just explained that you'd have to consider in coming up with your value. So it's all there in 43 already.
I'm sorry, Ross, I couldn't understand you.
So it's the challenge of the fact that this actually is sitting alongside the existing standard. So it's trying to envisage how this piece of wording would then add to the existing standard.
Yeah, just saying that the amendments here that are going to be in the ED refer to the existing paragraphs in 43. Paragraph 25 in IPSAS 43 still applies, as 26B points out when it refers to 25C and D.
You okay with that, Patricia?
Yes, I understand this. My question is, for example, in EG 62, it's in accordance with EG 62, a right of use asset held by a lessee in a concessionary lease is initially measured at the present value of payments for the lease. For the lease, only the yes, it's not the same. In my view, it's not the same. What I say in 26B and AG 62. It's my question here.
Can I step in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. So we have also received a suggestion from New Zealand to incorporate AG 62 and 63 into 26A and 26B. So moving that precisely to avoid that confusion. This has already been worked also with them, and it's part of the package of the suggestions that New Zealand also made.
Okay,
to us.
thanks. Well, if you can just check that through, that sounds as though that fixes that problem. So thanks, everyone. Liang, you've been waiting patiently.
Yes, actually, I think in addition to in this paragraph, in addition to we mention paragraph 25C and D, actually we should also add 25B, because 25B it is said about any lease payment made at or before the commercial date less any lease incentive received. I think even for concessional lease, we should also include this item in the initial recognition, initial measurement of the lease.
Thanks, Liang. Sure.
Thanks, Liang. So staff and task force also discussed that, and the reason for our proposal not to include is twofold, because that paragraph also has two items. So the first thing is that the first paragraph, A, it entails all the lease payments, irrespective when those payments are made before the lease, during the lease. So it means that the first portion is already included in 26A, which is all the market lease payments. So irrespective of we do it, those lease payments before or the lease, the commencement of the lease or during the lease. And the second portion, which is the lease incentives. So lease incentives, as per IPSAS 43, are enticements to get the lessee to enter into the lease. We don't expect in a concessionary lease to have lease enticements, because it is precisely the other way around. It is the lessor that it is giving benefit to the lessee So they'll see, of course, we'll accept it even without these incentives. So, and that's where we landed, but thanks.
Does that make sense, Liang, to you?
Actually, when I read this paragraph, actually I cannot see that these incentive included in this paragraph. So
Is there something that would be worthwhile a conversation offline then, Liang, between you and Joao, just to make sure that
okay.
you have, you know, that there's not an additional factor you've picked up that wasn't in that original discussion? Okay. So with that, we move on then to page 9 in the draft DD. Yeah, Linley.
Thank you very much. Just looking at the lessor side, in ED 43, we have the indicators that you use to assess whether or not you have a finance lease and operating lease. And one of them is to look at the present value of the lease payments. I wondered if we do need to think about bringing the market value of payments if it's a concessionary lease. Because if you don't, and you have a concessionary lease, would you ever have a finance lease? Wouldn't they always be operating leases? So I just thought, I wondered if we need to bring that into the indicators.
Sure.
I don't have a straight answer. That's a really complex question to be answered off the cuff, but I'm more than happy to engage with you and Andrew to understand a little bit more of your question.
Okay, thanks, Joao. That sounds like the way forward on that. Okay, so if we move then on to page 10. So next then we move on to page 11. Then page 12. Page 13. Page 14. Yes, Lucy.
Thank you, Chair. Can we please go back to page 12? On page 18 of, I'm sorry, page 7, it was mentioned that paragraph 126A to 126C were added, but I cannot find those paragraphs. Thank you.
Sorry, Lucia, can I just check where you were in the document? I missed that.
It says on the amendments to IPSAS 43, 126A to 126C have been added. And that is on page.
I'm gonna. Yes, I see that. I'm gonna have to check, Lucy. I'll come back to you offline. What does this mean? Because I see your point. It's in the heading, but there are no paragraphs. Yeah. So I don't know what I've done. I don't remember. So I need to check with you later.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So then I'm not sure whether it's Renee first or Patricia. Renee, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. So just reflecting on our earlier conversation, AG 62 makes reference to the lease at market rates.
Sorry, which page are you on, Renee?
14.
Yeah, okay.
14. So AG 62 makes reference to lease at market rates based on current use. And I think it's here that we would want to elaborate. Now I know that AG 62 is now being moved into the cortex, I think. But maybe there could be other AGs to further elaborate on what we mean here, because I think that was the whole point of our discussion this morning. This is where I would position it. I will link him there, and that's just a thought I'm having. Thank you.
Sorry, Rene, I couldn't understand.
Oh, do you mind just speaking closer to the mic? You're a bit, yeah, just move the mic closer.
I was just making the point that I think the additional articulation that we want to make based on this morning's conversation about lease at market rates based on current use. I think this is here where I would link additional AG paragraphs in order to further articulate what we mean based on what we said this morning. But I do appreciate AG 62 is now being moved into the core text, but could still link this additional guidance we want to provide somewhere around here. That was just a placeholder for me in my mind.
That was the intention when New Zealand suggested that to move to above and to clarify what does it mean by current use in a single sentence about the current users of the asset with the service, the same service potential and service delivery. So it is a very succinct sentence, but it is consistent with the with measurement, and that is already included. So thanks for that, Rene.
Okay, thanks. That's good. So Patricia.
Thank you. In relation AG 63, I think the AG is about the in the situation where the entity cannot measure or cannot determine the lease payment at market rate. Yes. Yes.
Sure.
Sorry, I didn't understand
AG
the
63
yeah.
is about the situation where the entity cannot.
Yes, cannot.
Measure. Yeah.
But we'll go to paragraph 26 now. They will be merged. We'll go to the core text, basically. That paragraph AG 62 and 63 will be merged with paragraphs 26 that we have in the above.
Yes, but I think maybe the text could be clearly about it's specific for the concessionary lease. I think BCs is clearer than the core text, the ideas that are in BCs, and say, if the entity cannot measure the payments based on at market rates, then you can use the contractual and something like this, because it's difficult to do this movement and understand the rationale. It's only to clarify the core text.
Yeah,
my suggestion.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. The objective of moving those two AGs and merge them with paragraph 26 is that it will sit right at the requirements that are only related to concessionary leases, and we will address your suggestions. So we have already talked also the drafting with New Zealand. I'm more than happy to share with you if you also address with what we shared with them, your concerns offline. So.
Yeah, thanks, Joao. I think that's right. It's important just to see that drafting and then work any remaining issues through bilaterally. Renee, are you still in or no? Okay. So with that, we move on to page 15, which is the starter basis for conclusions. Yeah, Lindy.
Thank you very much. Just reading the section again on the definitions. So that's BC 106 to pretty much BC 113. We've already touched on it in the existing standard, BC 57 and 58, where we talk about binding arrangements and contracts. So I don't know if we want to include it just because we wanted to emphasize it for these type of arrangements, or if we should then bring this in to that section of the existing standard, because it is a bit of this explains it in a lot more detail, but we've already touched on it in the standard.
Yeah, sure.
More than happy to do that. I'll work with you that.
Okay.
The objective of having this is that we have a specific discussion with the board And it was a really important topic for the board, but perhaps the placement of this BC might be useful to be all together, because once we have the final standard, it's kind of displaced again when they're reading everything in a flow. But I'll work with you, Lynn and Andrew, to see if I'm putting this right there.
Ben, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wondered if we needed to do that at this stage. I just thought the BCs as here are the additional BCs that relate to this. We're bound to revisit all of the BCs when we get a final pronouncement. So I don't feel too strongly either way. If you feel we really need to do it now, we can do, but I felt this was the BCs that relate to what we've done on this part of the project. And I sort of was, I guess, more minded to keep
I mean, I'm assuming
standard.
process-wise, there's nothing that, as you say, inserting later, you know, as BC, so on, is actually would be acceptable, because I can see the point you're making there about communication. Lindy, back on that.
That's fine. Maybe we just change then some of the wording to say reconsidered, because it doesn't, you know, we did consider it before, now we considered it again and we're explaining again. So let's just. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Lindy. Right, so we move on then to page 16. Then page 17. Obviously, page 18, we've already talked about that, and there's some further reconsideration that will be done there by the task force. Todd, are you on 18? Yeah, okay.
Page 18, yep. Paragraph BC 126. And it's the final part of that in part C, where we're talking about cost benefit. And I've certainly been reflecting on that in terms of where we've landed, and reflecting on, we did an exposure draft about 5 years ago, and there were concerns around the cost benefit of measuring concession releases. And reflecting on the Australian experience, where they went out with something broadly in the sort of area that we are here, and got such a lot of pushback on the standard that they had introduced, that they backed away and gone to a disclosure approach. And I'm wondering whether we need to be a bit clearer in our BCs about our view on the cost benefit, given our history in ED64, and looking to the experience of standard setters in this space as well. So I'd like to think that we could beef up from a board perspective in the BCs why we see the costs being less than the benefits here, because my concern in exposing this again 5 years later is we might get the same pushback that how have you demonstrated 5 years later that suddenly the benefits far outweigh the costs here? So I think there is something that we need to be quite proactive about on the cost benefit side of things. And I'd like to see that potentially elevated in terms of this exposure draft, and think about the comms with our constituents here, because we have to appreciate that we're going out with this exposure draft on the back of a whole lot of history. And I think it's important that we do demonstrate to our constituents why ultimately we think that the benefits outweigh the costs, because we have had quite resounding feedback in the past that it doesn't. So there is something to think through here. If we don't change the BCs, fine, but we do need to address the issue, and maybe it's having a few paragraphs at the very beginning of the exposure draft acknowledging where we're at and what has been quite a history, and why we've got to where we've got to.
Thanks, Todd. I mean, I think you make a very good point about linking this in with the history of the project. So I think we would need to think how we could express that. But I think you're right that we do need to acknowledge that. Ross.
Yeah, just to acknowledge, I think this ED is going to go out with the feedback statement to the RFI. that links directly to ED 64 and the previous consultation on the original full right of use model, public sector model that was rejected. And I think some of the noise we heard on the concessionary leases in that was also a rejection of the model we'd proposed for lessee accounting at right of use that people weren't convinced by. So there is some history here we will have to get right in the comms, but I don't necessarily think we're in the wrong place of where our constituents have been pointing us to through the RFI and through previous work on this. So I think we're at the point where we do have to go out with this and hear what people think. And I do think the comms is important, but let's not forget that this is going out with the feedback statement to the RFI.
Yeah, I mean, I think though, I think we've got to think about all the various different avenues, but I think probably to Todd's point, actually, it is important. And I think your point is very important, Ross, actually, about the very mixed feedback that we got and the fact that some of it was actually much more specifically about the model rather than about the specific issue. And I think it's just useful to tease that out, because I think then what you're saying, Todd, is at least if we're clear that we have given it some consideration, which I think is what you're asking us to do, and certainly basis for conclusion seems to be a logical place just to, if you like, tease this out here, then we need to think there's a comms bit more, and as you say, there's at a glance, there's the feedback statement. And I think the more that we're actually clear that we have, it's not that we've just gone, this is something totally different or whatever, that we have actually thought a bit more. Because I do remember presenting on this and there was that whole we got a whole load of different feedback and nobody was, but it was a variety of things. Ross, back on that.
Yeah, more than happy to do that, but let's not forget the BCs we're proposing here start at 105. We have 104 BCs that talk about the previous stages of the project. If we want to pull things from that, that's fine and highlight it, but I don't think we should be writing new BCs to add on the end on this. And let's reference back if we have to, but we've already got a lot on this.
Mm-hmm.
I think where I'm at on this, it's what is the first thing that people are going to read? So I take your point, there's going to be a response to the RFI, but there's going to be an exposure draft as well. I want, when people pick up the exposure draft, we need to have acknowledged all of this stuff right at the beginning before they even dive into the detail. I think it's quite important in terms of the comms. So we really need to think about it now, whether it's part of the exposure draft or whether it's when we send something out, we acknowledge all of this so that they read it before even going to the response to the RFI and the exposure draft. Somewhere we need to really think about that, I think.
João.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Todd. So I want to elevate a little bit of what we are planning to do with the communication materials. And perhaps, it is a package. So it is not only the Cortex and the BCs. We have the initial introduction of the exposure draft itself, which talks about the history of the leases project. We can perfectly address your points here, which I think it is the best place without touching the BCs, addressing Ross's comments. We also have the at a glance that provides in a common English language the rationale that you are alluded to. So, and we also have the feedback statement that we will also discuss in a few minutes. So there are other places where we can communicate more effectively with our constituents in a more, how to say, relaxed language without the hard technical language that BCs or authoritative guidance or whatever. This would be my suggestion. Of course, we'll make this in a holistic approach, basically, with all across the whole documents.
Okay, I mean, I think that this needs thinking through in terms of, because I think clearly, different constituents will come in at different ways. So some would dive straight into the document. So I think there's the point that you make there, Todd. In a sense, actually looking at it, BC 105 starts at in January 2021, whereas actually we could probably actually add a sentence or two that just says, something that just acknowledges it. And I think, again, this goes to Lynn's point about, are these separate? Ultimately, they'll go, you know, into IPSAS 43. So, but I think there's no harm in putting something in there that just actually says that. And then I think there's this element of being consistent in what we say, and also probably saying it consistently in different places. So, you know, you've highlighted up front in the document, there's also, you know, so if we can just work offline on just actually firming up in those various different places, so that you know, it's just that wherever you start, you know, wherever you get into it, that it just is done holistically. Lynn.
Yeah, just a couple of observations. I think BC 126 is a long way into the document to be saying those messages. I think we could refer to other BCs, but I think up front in the ED, what we're not doing at the moment is explaining that the ED is part of a communications package. So maybe there's a bit of signposting up the front of the ED that points people to, if you want to understand the development of the project, look at the at a glance or the feedback statement. Or so I think there's probably a bit of signposting rather than doing a whole load more drafting in the ED itself. I think signposting would work better than we do the drafting once. And
well, and indeed link it to IPSAS 43, where we've actually,
and we can point that in, you know, history of the project, look at the BCs in ED and IPSAS 43. So I think I would be inclined, or would recommend to the board, that we take an instruction away that looks at the signposting rather than do a whole load of introductory drafting.
Okay. I mean, I think it's fixable in a range of different ways, and I don't think it's extensive, but I think, as you say, it's actually really just making sure that this is situated in all of that previous history and it acknowledges that previous history. Because, you know, I think Todd's right that our constituents will come back at us and say, well, etc. So there's just a balance to be struck there. Abdullah, you've been waiting for a while. Apologies.
No, it's fine. Thank you, Ian. And much of what I wanted to say was said by Lynn, because I thought the feedback statement did a good job on that. And just to add to that, when I looked back into the responses to ED 64, some of the responses were not even leases to talk about it, and the feedback statement covered those cases. So probably if we just highlighted that more stronger in the feedback statement, but I guess the feedback statement did a good job to cover that. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Abdullah. I mean, we will come back in a moment and pick up on, but I think again that just highlights this, just thinking a bit about how that, you know, we just situate it in the context of all that's gone before, and we don't want to reiterate, you know, but we do need to make sure that we make those linkages and our constituents see that we've done it in that way. Okay, so. Sorry, I've lost my place now. I think we were on about page 18. Just so if we look at page 19, page 20, page 21, page 22, and then we're on the illustrative examples, so no changes there. 23, that's actually, I'll just check are there any comments on the illustrative examples? Okay, any other comments to pick up then? Lindy.
Thank you. It's just on the comparison with IFRS 16 and with the GFS. The last bullet, I think we just need to clarify that we've introduced disclosure requirements on concessionary leases.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
On both tables. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, Camira.
Thanks, Chair. I just have a clarification question in the illustrative examples. in the last part where we are, is the lessor side. Yes, I see there is the asymmetric treatment, and also that comes out automatically in to my view, but I was wondering, why is the unguaranteed residual value included as part of the financial asset from the lessor side? So
Sorry, Camilla, where are
yes,
you?
I'm in the page 29. And then I'm in the part of the buyer lessor accounting, where we are in the financial asset. The financial asset is not only including the payments and all that, but it's also including the unguaranteed residual value. And that is directly asymmetric with the lessee treatment. And I was wondering, is there a reason, or there's some specific requirement in IPSAS 43? It's just for my understanding. So,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Camila. I'm more than happy to explain. So this is how it works in terms of lease accounting, where the financial asset, which is called net investment in the lease, comprises two elements: the discounted lease payments and any unguaranteed residual value, if it exists. If it exists, we need to add it to that financial asset. If it doesn't exist, we only have the present value of lease payments. So this is part of the mechanics of the model of accounting for lessors. So we are not adding more here, we're just explaining how it works.
Okay, so I think, Camila, we just need to allow you to think that one through, and if you can take it up bilaterally with João, if you still think there's a problem on that. Yeah, Patricia.
Thank you. It's only for clarification too. Is there a motivation to quote the IFRS 15 in example 25, page 28?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. Good spot. So the reason is that when we finalize IPSAS 43, we are not referring to IPSAS 9 for revenue recognition, as we haven't yet a revenue standard, which are the principles drawn, the board decided that all the references in IPSAS 43 will be made to IFRS 15. So as we already have those references in IPSAS 43 in the core tax application guidance, so we are only expanding that also to the illustrative examples. Of course, all these IFRS 15 references will be replaced with a new revenue standard, as it is already foreseen by that project. But thanks, Patricia. Yeah, everything is
everything's linked to everything else at the moment. Yeah, and everything's moving. Okay, thanks very much. So I think with that we've completed the walkthrough. So obviously there's a number of changes there that you and the task force will work on later on today, and bilaterally. So we would be on the same time frame then in terms of giving the board a marked up draft. And again, I think marked up, obviously accept the changes from this version, but mark up for the subsequent changes made today. And that will be by the end of or before the collaboration time tomorrow, not tomorrow, Thursday. Yeah, Todd.
Are we continuing through pages 32 to 39 of the ED?
Do we need to? Do you want to? Are there any points there? Okay, fine. Okay, so João moves on.
Well, thanks, board, for your patience of going through page by page. Really helpful. So please stay tuned to your emails or even on the lobby of this floor to reach out to you. Moving to the next item. So as Ian decided, so we'll have the approval on the Friday, so please jump to the agenda item 6.2.3, which is the last agenda item of the papers. Basically, I would even suggest to go to the feedback statement itself. So just to give a brief overview. So this was IPSASB instruction to staff and task force to develop this feedback statement for basically two reasons. Because we have a request for information, and also we have an exposure draft. However, the exposure draft does not address all the issues that it was in the request for information. Basically, the purpose of this document is to provide the IPSASB's views on the whole that process and to complement. It's part of the packet, the communication package that goes with the ED. So the objective is to publish this feedback statement in the same day of the exposure draft, together with the at a glance, together with the news release. So just for the board to understand the context of this feedback statement, and more than happy to receive comments on the document. And with this,
yeah, thank you, Shah. And obviously, this isn't an official board document, so it's not up for approval. But obviously, if members, given that to an extent this is an evolving area for us, if there are any comments that board members want to make, yeah, so.
Thanks, Ian. And helpful to have the feedback statement. It's just, in my mind, the way that we position this. So I think the RFI process was the first time that we'd issued something of that nature. And the language that's been used in putting this together is about a consultation process and comment letters. And I don't think what we were doing with the RFI was a consultation and comment letter type process. That feels very exposure draft language. And so I think we need to change that narrative throughout this feedback statement to acknowledge that it was a request for information. So we've received the information and we've thought about that information and putting up proposals in the EG together and feeding back. So it's just the language that we're using, I think, that's important that we get right here, particularly given that this is our first one of these.
Thanks, Todd. Ross, I think you want to come in and then I'll go to Scott.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Todd. I think it'd be helpful if we discuss this, we agree as a board what we'd like to call that rather than comment letters. If it's just feedback or something general, it'd be good if we could just agree that before we start to try and process changes. But I take your point.
Scott, you on that?
Yeah, I just want to compliment staff. I thought it was well done. I gave some comments offline, but I thought it was a really good communication. We talked about need to communicate with our constituents. I thought they did a really good job because often they don't get the feedback. And I think that telling them we heard them is important. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Scott. I think it is important. And, that, probably there's also sort of like the heading, IPSASB's response or IPSASB's thinking maybe might be a sort of softer, because there's still, obviously it's going to go out with an exposure draft, but that's a proposal. So if we can just have a think about that. And one additional comment, if I may, I think to the sort of just, there's a couple of places where we say there's already sufficient guidance in, and I think we sort of discussed that we might, propose to add implementation guidance if we're talking about IPSAS 31. Well, we've got a project there, and actually that probably would just, as we know, it's non-authoritative, it's not going to change, but actually it's just being seen to have responded. And that wouldn't commit us, we don't have to do that now, but if we just said that we'll look at that as part of the upcoming work on, IPSAS 31, I think it just sort of, again, it says we've listened and we're not saying don't be so stupid, it's just that kind of acknowledgement, I think. Any other comments on the feedback statement, sort of at a principal level? Yeah, Claudia.
Thank you. Maybe we should announce something somewhere in the document that it's non-authoritative, something like that directly, because we give, I'm not really, what's the flavor then? When I read IPSAS board's response, so it seems that it's an official response. Then we said it's something in between. It's more a comment on the feedback received. So I agree with Todd that we have to make sure that we use the right language, not to fulfill the expectation when reading someone document.
Thanks, Claudia. Ross.
Yeah, I think in line with my previous intervention, I think we should move away from comment letter, and I think we should say feedback received across the document. And instead of IPSASB's response, I think we should go with IPSASB's thinking, because this is capturing the board's thinking in developing the ED that we've been talking about, as well as the feedback overall. And I think that'll make it clear that this isn't an authoritative document for the board for people to apply.
Yeah, and there might just be some sort of footnote or something like that that just sort of underlines that, that it's non-authoritative, and, I mean, and that might just be on the back page or something, that kind of sort of a bit of boilerplate or something like that. Renee.
Yes, thank you. Totally agree with Scott. This is a great way to communicate differently to our stakeholders. And hearing about the comments, I agree. I'm thinking at the very front, we have a brief history, but we don't have a purpose. So maybe you want to state the purpose of this document, and this is where you do it overall. And maybe it's an opportunity also to state and showcase this new way to outreach and communicate in the purpose, right? Kind of give a bit of a background and a rationale for why we're doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. I think that would sit it quite nicely. It's a good place to give that context. Over to Adrienne, and then I will break us for coffee.
Well, I would just add to the comments with which I fully concur. And I would like to highlight the fact that for me, after we've had all those technical discussions, this is one of the most important documents that the IPSAS board can issue to the world, I would say, because it's the link between the two missions we have, the one to develop standards and the other one to advocate for the application and adoption of those standards. So this document should be elaborated without losing track of the intention that we have, that people agree to approve, agree, or whatever, feel comfortable with the standards that we are trying to develop or we are developing. And second, that those who have not adopted IPSAS find in reading such documents reasons for adopting the document, because we very clearly develop the argument that this addresses the issues that they have in accounting for their public financial management. So for me, this is a very, very important document, and I fully support the idea that we should just tell readers what was the purpose of entering into that project. Well, the whole project, phase one with leases and phase two with these very specific aspects of leases in public sector.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. I think that's, it's great. I think that the board, appreciates this. And I think, your points in terms of communication, it is a very accessible form of communication, and that makes it really important for the reasons that you set out. So I think with that, we are ready for a break. Thank you very much once again to Joao and to the task force. I think, you've done some great work on a really complex area. And I think the discussions we've had today, the input has been really good, and I think we'll really solidify this, and we should be at a stage where then we can approve on Friday, which is great progress. So thanks everyone. And if we take a 20-minute break, so back at 5 past, please, and then we'll go into the feedback on the Advancing Sustainability consultation paper. Thanks everyone. Okay, has anybody seen Claudia and Renee as well? Okay, so now we move into the first of two sessions on sustainability reporting today. The first session is the public session looking at the responses and the analysis of the responses that staff have been preparing since the September meeting. And obviously we then have the closed session for the board when we talk about our strategic positioning, way forward, etc. So in this discussion, and board members obviously have had sight of the slides we're proposing to use, but if you can keep your comments to just being that we're clear on what our stakeholders have said rather than starting to move into that next strategic discussion. So that's just if you know, we can have that lens on it. Welcome then both Dave and in particular Celine to the table. And Celine in particular has been doing a lot of work on the analysis of the responses, and I think it's a, you know, there's a lot of subtleties and so on to go at. So perhaps without further ado, Celine, pass to you.
Thank you, Ian. So as Ian mentioned, we'll take this time to focus on the comments and the feedback we've received. I know in September, the comment period had just closed prior to during our board meeting in Portugal. And so at that point, we had a high level preliminary analysis and a summary that we shared with you then. And at this point, we will go through the detailed analysis. We will take time to go through PV by PV, SMC by SMC, and we'll pause and if there's any further comments that the board would like to share as well, we'll take this time to go through that. And then we've also identified key issues that came out of the feedback received that we'll spend some time on as well. And so just a recap for everyone, there are many different sources of feedback, and this summary and analysis covers all of these from the regional roundtables we held back in July and August with almost 500 attendees across 127 countries. 70 written responses, lots of engagement there as well. Something interesting to note was that almost half of these respondents were new respondents, like respondents who had never submitted comment letters to the IPSASB in the past. So that I think really speaks to, you know, the broad interest and engagement in this project. And we've certainly had discussions with the KEG. So back in June, we walked through the CP, and again, we walked through the feedback this Monday at the KEG meeting and got further feedback from them as well. And then, of course, we had the discussions at the forum in Portugal, the Public Sector International Standard Setters Forum, where we had 107 attendees, heard Lee White and Bastian Buck speak, and lots of great discussion there as well. So we've incorporated all of that feedback into this analysis here. So from the feedback, we identified 3 key themes. And these themes will start off with the broad support for global public sector specific sustainability guidance and the need and urgency for public sector specific guidance. Really, the respondents spoke to the broad impact of public sector compared to the private sector, really the larger stakeholder base, broader impacts beyond an investor focus, beyond enterprise value, really impact reporting and focus on public accountability of the public sector. And with that in mind, though, with such breadth of sustainability and the impact of the government, there is a call, a recurring theme across the board to focus on the scope, that for the IPSASB to define the scope and objectives of this guidance, to provide clear direction and a framework for moving forward. Certainly materiality was another recurring theme and issue that was identified. Is it, how do we define materiality? Is it double materiality? And recognizing the differences between the IPSASB approach, the GRI approach, the EFREG approach. And finally, another recurring issue was the level of government. What level of government does this apply to? Is it whole of government? Is it policy level? Is it entity level? Is it sector level? And that'll be a significant challenge to consider as well. The second key theme that we'll speak to is the strong support for IPSASB's role and the leadership role that we can take in developing public sector specific sustainability guidance. There was many commendations for the IPSASB's reputation and experience in public sector standard setting, the due process that's a well-established and the years of experience, the international relationships that the IPSASB has in place already that will help leverage and enable the development of these standards and guidance. However, at the same time, there was a challenge for the need for expertise, sustainability expertise at the board and at staff levels. And really this ties back to, the reputation of the board. You have a great reputation in standard setting. We need to ensure that we protect that and have the same quality of standards issued in the financial reporting space and the sustainability space. So there was this call again for sustainability expertise. There were some respondents who felt maybe the use of a sustainability reference group is sufficient for a transitional period. Some who felt, oh, you should consider establishing a separate board like the IPSASB. And so there was a range, but overall, definitely the need to establish sustainability expertise as we go and start developing this project. And thirdly, there was support for general sustainability related and climate related disclosures as first topics. So this is in line with the IPSASB's approach, IFRS S1 and S2 as proposed in the CP. And overall, there was support for the IPSASB considering working and leveraging these to private sector standards and adapting them for public sector standards. However, definitely I identified many challenges, potential challenges with adapting for public sector for consideration. And also many pointed to GRI, which we are having discussions with and working with closely, but they really emphasized the potentially broader scope that GRI may bring, and so encouraged to work together with GRI as well. And also considering other issues beyond general sustainability and climate, particularly for the public sector. We heard, the public sector has a broader impact, public accountability, social issues should be prioritized. And there was a number of respondents who pointed at different jurisdictions having different priorities. Say in developing countries, there were strong remarks about the importance of social issues before climate. But at the end of the day, even those respondents did mostly agree with general sustainability related and climate related as first topics, but highly encourage the consideration for other topics as well. So pause there, Ian, if there's any.
Yeah, thanks. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each of the PVs and have a look in more detail at what was actually said. But I wanted to just sort of pause before we move into that to see if there are any general comments. And I was thinking, Thomas, actually, I mean, there probably will be CAG feedback that's relevant as we move through each of these, but I don't know whether you want to make any opening comments or not. And then I'll ask the members for any comments.
No, definitely. I will feed in the kind of results of the CAG discussion when it comes up to when it comes to the respective PVs. I think what I can just say is that it probably echoes what we heard from the public consultation. So very much kind of going in the same directions, broad support in general, but warning regarding expertise, regarding reputation, and issues like that. We had the discussion in June when we went through the single PVs and SMCs, and we had the discussion just on Monday on higher level issues, which I reported in my summary, but I will feed that in later.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. So are there any comments members want to make before we move into more detailed analysis? Adrian, are you still in or no? Oh, Mike, do you want to come in?
So thank you, Chair. I just had a comment on the slide before moving into the PVs on the breakdown of the respondents. I found it very interesting that we have that new respondent, nearly the half, and then I looked into the list of the organization or countries commented, and I think there's a certain concentration on certain countries, and therefore I would recommend or remind just also for future activities to ensure that we take all stakeholders on board of the different countries, because even as it is in Germany, as it is not the Ministry of Finance, it's really other stakeholders, we should really to ensure having most of them on board. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Scott.
Yeah, I wasn't going to make a comment, but Mike got me to thinking about a comment. Ian, I shared with you that I was at the AICPA board meeting a couple of weeks ago, and about half of our agenda over 3 days was on sustainability. But what was interesting, majority of the members are CIMA members, not CPA members, and they'd gone out and talked a lot about the members and interviewed them. And I was surprised at the large percentage of them that came from public sector, that were CIMA members, and how much they talked about this topic. So I just want to echo what Mike said, that this is not surprising, actually, based on what I heard a couple of weeks ago from. And AICPA has 725,000 members. So there's definitely a bigger population than I thought out there.
Yeah, thanks. I think that, and I mean, it was one of the points that I think came through in some of the discussion, but I've heard it from elsewhere, and it's this point about the fact that not only does this get us in front of different audiences, but also maybe different jurisdictions as well, because if we move forward in this space, there's the potential that countries could be using the sustainability reporting guidance, even if they're not actually using IPSAS. So that's one of the things that we're going to have to think about. But I think in terms of that overall thinking about communication and so on, that's going to be really, I think that's going to be really important. And for example, if you look at it, that I've already done slots at 2 successive Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting meetings, which is the OECD Budget Officials Forum. Again, it gets you into different places. And I think we need to think about not only, how do we actually capitalize on that, and how do we, expand the dialogue. Thomas.
Yeah, I would have brought that point later, but as you mentioned now, I think one of the discussions and kind of asked for clarification in the CAC discussion. I just read the June minutes again. It came up already at that point in time, was kind of to clarify what type of guidance are you going to issue, and what is the relation to the standards which you issue on financial reporting. So are they in coexistence? Are they interrelated? What does it mean being mandatory? What does it mean being in compliance with IPSAS? Does it require to kind of be in compliance with both types of guidance, financial and sustainability? That has to be clarified very much upfront before you kind of step into more detailed work.
Thanks, Thomas. Any other general comments before we start to move through the PVs? Yeah, Abdullah.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And just to reflect to the point that you mentioned the number of stakeholders, just many, and I've came across an example where we just was trying to share the CP with the public sector. Different agencies they came across, and they were saying why you are taking the advantage, or you are coming front runner and talking about this subject. Because when we talked about Ministry of Economics, they had something. Then we talked about Ministry of Agriculture, they had their own perspective. Then you have all these different players. Then you are going to be having all different stakeholders, and how you're going to manage the expectations. Then when you talk to them that it's coming from a financial background, they're going to be talking to you. There is other non-financials. How are you going to capture for that? So just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Abdullah. So I think probably at this stage we start to move forward then with a more detailed analysis.
Okay. Thanks, Ian. So on preliminary review 1, the IPSASB's view was that there is a need for global public sector sustainability reporting guidance. So as you can see, strong support here. Almost all of at the regional roundtable and even in written responses strongly supported this. Just to preface before we get into all of the preliminary reviews, where we differentiate agree versus partially agree. Partially agree is generally where they do agree with the statement, but have some exception in their response. And so, for example, here, partially agree, those respondents who partially agreed that there is a need, but they question perhaps the urgency, really balancing that timeliness, like time to market versus quality, like the urgency that we would move with, or the extent of guidance needed, questioning what's really focusing on what's really different from private sector compared to public sector, and challenging the board to think about, okay, what would really be the focus of this public sector specific sustainability guidance. And again, that kind of goes back to the objective and scope that many others also raised. And so that just gives you a bit of color as to how we differentiate agree versus partially agree. And I'll certainly go through that as we go PV by PV. But as you can see in preliminary review 1, there's strong support, and the key issues that came out of this was, again, focus on scope, objectives, who are the primary users, materiality, level of government. Another issue that came out of this that Thomas alluded to just now as well is not an issue or question that we asked, but many asked us, will this be mandatory or non-mandatory? How will this standards, is this standards or guidance? Thinking about, is this likened to RPGs, which are non-mandatory and separate from the IPSAS? And will that, if so, will that really encourage enough uptake? Given that, as currently we don't see a lot of uptake in the RPGs. So those were some of the challenges and questions raised in this PV1.
Thanks, Celine. Comments then. Any comments from members before I go to Thomas? Thomas, the floor is yours.
Regarding PV1, just to kind of say upfront that there was obviously broad support from CAG, both in June and in kind of Monday, December meeting, that there is a need for that. I think many kind of CAG members focused on especially that the scope and the objective need to be clarified upfront. We discussed several key issues which are important to be looked at, but those two are the ones who should be looked at first. Others could wait. So I think that's important to say. That the second one was to kind of have a clear and own definition of what do you mean by sustainability. Everybody talks about sustainability, but what are you talking about when you talk about sustainability in the public sector? I will come back to that later when it comes to broader views and SDGs or focus on kind of general sustainability related information and climate related disclosures, but that was a clear ask as well.
Thanks, Thomas. Over, Adrian.
Well, I agree that there are many definitions of sustainability, but if you go through all the definitions, probably the UN definition is the most, effective one. That is satisfying your present needs without compromising the needs of the future generation, without compromising the capacity of the future generation to satisfy their own needs. And this has to do, in a way, with the going concern of an entity, be it public or private. So I'm sure we will find easily our way through the scoping and the setting objectives for our future work. Now, when respondents say that they believe there is a need for global public sector sustainability reporting, we probably need to differentiate between first of all, the jurisdictions, and within the jurisdiction, the level of concern. Central governments, local governments, public entities, because it's probably different. The concern may differently root from the environment of the people who express the concern. In countries, let's say countries, who have a concern with access to capital market, there's probably a different view on, okay, informing the capital providers on the sustainability of the jurisdiction, its capacity to meet future engagements. Whereas in I would say countries that have no real issue with accessing capital markets, it's more a political and social issue. And when politicians declare that they are concerned with sustainability, it's more because they are under the demand of public opinion, because it's also trendy for many people, more than a vital issue. So we probably need to be aware of that when developing our standards in the future. The second aspect of that is that I've already discussed the issue of the triangle risks: financial, operational, reputational. Indeed, we have the RPGs that help financial statement preparers to provide information on the financial sustainability. But if we understand, if people understand that it's a triangle and that financial sustainability is only one of the three apex of this triangle, it has retroactive actions on each of the other two. So we can link and relate financial sustainability probably more easily than we believe with the other two.
Thanks, Adrian. Scott. Oh, sorry, Thomas, are you coming back on? Yeah, okay, and then I'll go to Scott.
If you allow, Scott. Just want to build on the remark Adrian just made. Probably he didn't mean it like that, but it motivates me to echo a warning which was coming up in the CAG, not to underestimate the effort. You said it's an easy way, we will find an easy way to scope and objective. I think CAG members warned not to underestimate the task to define scope and objective for the public sector, because the differences are much broader and the impact is much broader compared to private sector. I think that leads to questions like, what's the right level of kind of reporting where you look at? Is it the entity level? Is the whole of government level? Do you kind of have a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach? Is it the perspective of the impact of government on the environment, or is it the perspective of the impact of environment on the government? So these are all questions which had to clarify beforehand, and they are completely different compared to private sector. So there was a huge warning not to underestimate that.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay, Scott, to you.
I didn't say easily. I said more easily than we believe.
Yeah. We're still at the difficult end of the spectrum. Scott, to you.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering on the responses where it talked about users of guidance and maybe stakeholders, because I have a belief you don't have a choice in this area, because even if public sector itself doesn't care, public sector is integral in scope 2 and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and they're a very important part of the supply chain. So we're going to be drugging, the public sector is going to be drugging this whether they like to or not, because everybody else that is reporting on it is going to need the information the public sector has. So the question is, how do we want to facilitate that process to make that information available? So I didn't know if any of that came up in any responses, but clearly when you talk on the commercial side, public sector is at the crossroads of a lot of what they need. So,
Celine?
So that didn't specifically come up as to part of the demand for producing such reporting. But certainly we're seeing that many jurisdictions are already starting to find their own way, because they do need this reporting, and certainly that could be one of the reasons.
Yeah, and I think that comes into the whole issue about scope. And when you talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, when you take that broader perspective, then you're absolutely right. You're thinking about, you know, literally global supply chains. And again, that argues for, you know, maximizing alignment, commonality, and so on. And some of what IPSASB is starting to do in terms of, you know, thinking about the data collection side and the practicalities. Actually, again, I think is going to be relevant in thinking about that, because a lot of people want to know, how can I do this? What can I, you know, so I think that is something that we should definitely have a think about. So I've got Mari and then Nima.
Thank you. It is a keyword that global public sector specific sustainability report, and the specific public sector specific is a very important. However, there is some linkage between the public sector and private sector's sustainability reporting, and one possible linkage exists in the both sectors has a target or the goal for attain the sustainability. And second, both sectors set the sustainability goals and evaluate the performance results. And so that we have to focus on these two sectors linkage and interoperability. And it is a so great challenge for us. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right in that, Mari. Nima.
Thank you, Chair. I'm actually very impressed with the results. Only sad that Tanzania didn't feature in the respondents. I know they were trying, maybe they missed the deadline, but we really see the need. And this year I got a chance to present at the annual accountants conference, where the members of the Parliamentary Accountants Committee were there, and they really bought the idea. And as a country, we have the stock exchange now requiring the listed entities to present information on sustainability. They have given out their guidelines, and the Accountants Board has also issued their statement where they have requirements on environment, social and governance. So it's partly that requirement on sustainability. I think I'll be able to share some of the reports when they come out. So if we have a guidance for the public sector, and of course there will be one for the private sector, then I think that will be very useful, because as Eastern and Southern Africa through ESAG, we're also trying to come together under API to see what we can have on the reporting in this particular area. Thank you.
Thanks, Naima. I think it's, we're certainly aware that there's a huge amount going on at jurisdiction level around the world, and that's obviously both in the private sector, but we know from contacts with other standard setters and with members how much is going on as well, and the need to make progress in the public sector is certainly pressing. Okay, shall we move on then to the second preliminary review? Oh, apologies, just before we go into that, Budwan, you had your flag up. Okay, so preliminary review 2.
Okay, thank you. So preliminary review 2, as covered in the overview, really a lot of strong support as well for the IPSASB to take on this leadership role and support that IPSASB does have the experience, process, and relationships to enable it to develop such global public sector sustainability reporting effectively. And here you'll see there's a strong support, 50%, but the partially agree, they all support, but the main focus here again was that need to introduce and bring in more sustainability expertise. So that was a strong message, I think, coming from 34% that partially agreed. And so as mentioned, there was a mix of views on the role of the sustainability reference group, if that's enough, or if you need a separate board, or if it's maybe a transitionary approach, given this is a long-term project. But there was also support that this is appropriate given the urgent need to get started. And so that's the main focus. Some other comments on this were related to the conceptual framework. Some respondents, I think in our CP, we say that our conceptual framework is sufficient as is to cover the work of the sustainability reporting guidance, as we also address general purpose financial reports. And so there were many who agreed with that, and others who also suggested that we need to revisit the conceptual framework, consider if we need to expand it to include sustainability reporting, and others who felt you may need a fully separate conceptual framework, which would be a large undertaking for sure. And another, in addition to the expertise that that would be needed on the board, going back to reputation, another consideration was really capacity of the board. Would this challenge the capacity of the board to be able to continue to produce such high quality financial reporting? We have already a lot on our work program, certainly. And so there were respondents who pointed out as well and raised it for consideration that we need to also look at our capacity and ensure that we continue to provide high quality financial reporting guidance.
Thanks, Celine. So open up for any comments from board members. Thomas.
Yeah, regarding PV2, I think we touched on that in June and December as well. So it's starting probably that I think majority of the CAG members agreed that there is no alternative organization with the standard setting experience and wide range of contexts compared to the IPSASB. So it would be the right starting point. Definitely in that context, the warning was brought up regarding expertise and capacity. And in that kind of regard, there was a discussion which was mentioned earlier regarding reputation. It's not only the reputation if you kind of issue non-top quality sustainability standards, but it's also the kind of pushback if you use capacity for sustainability, which you can't use then for high quality financial reporting standards. So that there is a reputational risk from two sides. Regarding the procedures, there was also a remark made to clarify how this project is connected to the current conceptual framework. Clarify that upfront before you go into development of detailed guidance. Do you need kind of just an expansion of the conceptual framework? Is it already covered by kind of reference to non-financial reporting? Or do you need a completely separate conceptual framework? Last but not least, regarding the structure, there was support for the sustainability reference group, but to look at that as only a temporary solution and not a kind of a long-term a fix of the organizational request, probably on the mid to long term, a separate board would be needed. So I think that was the impression of the CAG.
Thanks, Thomas. Any other comments at this stage? Yes, Todd.
Yeah, I think it's probably more an observation. I found it interesting, the percentages that came through on this compared to the first question. And knowing that we had quite a lot of new constituents feedback on this, I wonder whether we have done any analysis sort of below this level to suggest that those that partially agree or disagree are perhaps more the traditional respondents versus the 50 that agree, and whether that might suggest that we've got quite a lot of work to do in terms of reassuring those that are interested in the financial reporting standards that we set, that we would be able to accommodate both their needs as well as those that are interested in the sustainability. So it was really getting underneath the percentages here that I think was more relevant for us to understand than the percentages themselves.
Do you want to respond on that, Celine, or because I know Ross is waiting to come in? So.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't do specific analysis on really most of these new respondents or our previous respondents agreeing or disagreeing, but from what I recall, I think it was fairly mixed and dispersed for those really emphasizing the need for expertise. There, I can definitely certainly recall some new respondents and some, of our recurring, like certain accounting bodies or whatnot that also really called for that expertise. So it was quite broad, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Ross.
Yeah, my point's kind of related and kind of different. For me, I kind of ignore the numbers when I look at the response letters. I don't find them all that helpful. I think positionally, it's always good to look at the numbers, but when I read through the responses on this PV and thought about them, it actually surprised me that really wasn't anything new in there. If you look at the narrative, what's in the CP behind the preliminary view, all of the issues that were flagged as potential concerns that came through in the partially agrees and the disagrees were points acknowledged in the CP itself that we've been talking about since the beginning. So we know there's a knowledge gap and that there's upskilling needed for the board and for staff. We know that we have to balance this with our existing processes, and we know we're getting new stakeholders that might have different views. So it was quite reassuring, actually, when I looked at the feedback and read it as is, because it didn't have any big surprises of things like, well, we didn't think about that. It's all there, and we've been thinking about it. The key issue is, what are we going to do about it, to me? And I think that's what we'll talk about later.
Thanks, Ross. I mean, I think it probably would be just useful just to firm up on that analysis, just in case there's anything that comes out from that. But yeah, as you say, Ross, we know the general issues. Over, Adrian.
I have a small concern about the way we interpret the answers that we received. And there has been discussions, I remember there has been discussions in Cascais about the IPSASB board not being able, but being legitimate in this area. And well, we shouldn't be mistaken, and we shouldn't create ambiguity on these two aspects of the question. Well, we believe that we are legitimate, and I think we are, and we had discussions on that. But the main issue then is, are we able to do it? I think we are able to do it, but then we will have that resource issue. And the resource issue has been addressed by some respondents who suggested either a sustainability reference group or creating a separate sustainability specific board. This will be one of the fundamental questions we have to answer. Because I do believe that, having heard of what people in this room or outside during the forum in Portugal, I mean, many believe that we are truly legitimate in this area. So this should be also clearly stated that the IPSAS board believes it is legitimate, but he has a real concern about its ability to develop the standards operationally.
Thanks, so Thomas.
Just to reiterate what I said earlier, and I think that's going in exactly the same direction. I think it's all coming back to legitimacy. I think from the first point of view, kind of everybody agrees that the board, the IPSAS board, is the legitimate body to set the standards, but that legitimacy could be endangered in the next minute if you do not answer the question for capability, expertise, and capacity beforehand, before you start with the work. Because then people could kind of question that legitimacy. I think that was kind of another perspective on the same topic.
Okay, let's move on then to preliminary review 3.
So preliminary review 3 said that the IPSASB would apply the framework in figure 5, which is the bottom left-hand corner there, just for your refresher, but that's similar to the TCFD model. And we would work in collaboration with other international bodies through the application of the IPSASB's current processes. So again, strong support from the regional roundtables, 98% agreed. In the written responses, 59% agreed, with 26% who partially agreed. And really, I would say that all respondents agreed with working in collaboration with other international bodies. Where they took point was really the application of this framework in figure 5. Many called for further clarification. Some questioned the applicability, given it's really TCFD private sector focused, and how would we apply that for the public sector? Some suggestions on the approach. Really, is it two separate pieces of the financial sustainability related, and then the broader outside view, or is it really one before the public sector? So some things to consider when we look to this framework, and how do we adapt it for the public sector, whether we're just looking at disclosing risks and opportunities, or do we bring in risk, opportunities, and broader impact as another suggestion. So that's where we see more of the partially agree, like challenging to reconsider and look at providing further clarification on that figure 5 and the applicability to the public sector. And so as mentioned, nearly everyone agreed with working in collaboration with other international standard setters. Really, as we propose, focusing initially on ISSBs, IFRS 1, S2, but many again pointed to GRI and thinking of the broader scope. And we'll discuss this as well, but certainly thinking about how to apply those private sector standards to the public sector, given the concepts of like investor focus, enterprise value, which we're seeing the ISSB sort of shift away from as well. So we'll continue to monitor and consider how to work with these other organizations.
Thanks, Celine. So open up for comments. Thomas, see you in on this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in on that one, as it was one of the questions specifically asked to the CAG on Monday regarding the collaboration with other bodies. I think, of course, and naturally, collaboration was supported broadly or in general. I think, again, it was repeated that in order to start that, it would be necessary to clarify what is scope and objective for the public sector beforehand. because there was an observation that even the private sector, or for the private sector, the IPSASB and the GRI do not appear to be able to reconcile on scope and the perspective. So if you just enter into kind of a cooperation with those who are not yet agreeing, it might add more confusion than clarity. So be clear on your direction beforehand and then kind of start cooperating. Regarding the formal policy, yes, there was kind of seen the need to create a formal policy to frame how to collaborate with other standard setters, and that might be more nuanced or might need to be more nuanced than the policy on IFRS alignment as we know it up to date. Again, I think the cooperation with other standard setters kind of puts the question on the table. How do your standards relate to these private sector based standards, or can you build on that? And I think there was a warning that the difference is bigger than thought, and there might be the need to kind of, yes, you can build on that incorporating with other standard setters, but you really have to be assured that you're not just simply adapting that, but really looking at the differences. I think that's it for the cooperation. Do we want to tackle on the general sustainability disclosures issue as well, which is PV4, or you want to touch on that later? Okay.
Well, I think let's just see if there are any other comments before we move into that. No, I think we're good. So, yep. Yeah, just a short comment regarding these the box and the two first focus areas. I think it was supported in general, especially the climate-related disclosures. I think there was a question: how do you define general sustainability-related disclosures? One member said this looks or sounds quite broad. What do you understand under that term? But in general, I think it was supported to kind of focus on these areas first and then do it step by step. Thanks, Thomas. Celine, do you just want to introduce the preliminary view, and then I'll go to Ajith at that point in time.
Thank you. And so, yes, on preliminary review 4 focused on proposing to address general sustainability related and climate related disclosures as first topics. So again, this was proposed in mirroring the IPSASB's first topics and S1 and S2. And so most respondents supported this, and the key issues that were raised was whether to consider other issues like social issues, especially for the public sector, which may not be as pressing for private sector. So particularly poverty, hunger, health, well-being were named as other key social issues, and also considering the impact of focusing on climate on certain jurisdictions such as emerging and developing nations, the considering peaking emissions and common but differentiated, which we do see in other requirements. And so another item that was pointed to was really tying back to SDGs and thinking about how will we tie our guidance into SDGs, the extent of that linkage, which is still a focus for many jurisdictions.
Thank you, Celine. So go to Ajith at this stage.
Thanks, Ian. I think Thomas well explained some of the issues that were raised during the CAG. I think those will also we need to consider as we go along in the sustainability project. But one of the key factors in also working together with international bodies will be the specifying the scope and identifying the scope, because the public sector scope has some differences from the private sector scope. So of course, there is a issues of that we discussed earlier, also related to the difficulty in doing something totally new. At the same time, so it's important also to consider the fact that the public will also expect the either now or at a later stage that sustainability for the public sector will need to consider jurisdiction that of the public sector and the area in which you're looking after the sustainability related issues. For instance, the climate change, you're not only looking at the climate change relating to the particular entity but the entity's climate change that is caused by the entity, but the climate change that the public sector is required to look after in your jurisdiction. So these aspects will also come into play, and therefore those differences can cause some expectation issues in relation to the public sector by the people who read the financial reporting, sustainability reporting guidelines that we are proposing. So those can be a little bit of a challenge while we are doing this exercise. I just wanted to highlight that aspect as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sajith. Any other points, Thomas?
Yeah, just one remark which kind of relates to some extent to the different perspectives of different jurisdictions, different focus areas, but also different capabilities. I think that was one remark which was made in that context, that as much as sustainability is a global problem, not only there are different focus areas from different jurisdictions coming from their respective background, but there's also different capabilities of jurisdictions, and therefore, and I think that was more general advice, that it kind of links somehow to that. The guidance, whatever focus area it refers to at the beginning, needs to be scalable in order to cater for the different capabilities, resources, and capacities of different jurisdictions. So I think just want to bring that in at that point.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay, so let's move on to the PV5.
Thanks, Thomas. So we'll actually go to SMC1. Sorry. Just following along the way the sequence in the CP, and really we asked respondents what other topics they see as pressing in their jurisdiction and why these may be prioritized. So really the largest response was climate. So really echoing climate being first topic for the IPSASB. And then that was closely followed by environment. So that includes natural resources, biodiversity, water, and so interestingly, the IPSASB issued a staff paper for their next week's meeting discussion that proposed some of the next topics as well. And the first on that list was biodiversity and ecosystems, which is, again, I think sort of echoed here when we're seeing environment as the next potential topic. And that could be, of course, we have the natural resources project as well. And then the next item was scope and governance, social and governance. So some of those social issues that we heard about, poverty, hunger, well-being. And interestingly, a large group of those respondents were from developing nations. And then the next was focus on SDGs. And a lot of folks still are looking for alignment with the SDGs, tying back. Certainly some of the comments that we heard even from the KEG was, thinking about the timeline of the SDGs. Some have expired, they will expire in 2030. So something for us to consider and think about when we think about tying to SDGs. And then finally, other comments that we heard were quite broad. So thinking about auditability, thinking about consultation with indigenous peoples, and then differentiated reporting, which I think made sort of tie back to scalability. Definitely something for us to think about in helping the adoption and uptake, whether it's initially long or over the long term.
Thanks. Thomas.
Just one addition in the context of the discussion regarding SNC1, it was brought up what I said earlier. It needs to be clarified what perspective and what level of reporting do you focus on. And in that context, it was seen that, at least from the perspective of that member making that comment, the biggest impact for public sector is at the whole of government level to exercise things like subsidies, tax policies, regulation, and change of behavior of the private sector and citizens. And in regards of the SDGs, it was also seen that they generally fit more with the whole of government perspective than with smaller entities and local governments. So the perspective was one of the most pressing issues to be clarified before.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay. So I think we move on to the PV5.
Right. So PV5 talked about the key enablers, and the CP proposed 5 key enablers that the IPSASB would need in order to take forward the development of public sector specific sustainability reporting guidance. And that was appropriate resourcing, an experienced and active sustainability reference group, efficient and effective use of IPSASB board member time, and coordination with other international sustainability standards, and then dialogue with national standard setters. And so most respondents agreed with this, with these key enablers. Really, those who partially agreed, and I think everyone acknowledges it's not an exhaustive list, but those partially agreed and emphasized other potential enablers, such as in there was like global support from other international bodies, inclusion of environmental and social agencies, again, funding, auditability of reports. So just another list. Other considerations, which certainly there are many other enablers that could be out there.
Thanks, Lynn. Any comments on PV5? Okay.
So that covers all of the PVs and SMCs. There was an SMC2 which asked for folks' support in funding and willingness to participate, which was everybody's willing to engage in discussions, certainly. So I won't cover that. But here is a summary of the key issues. I think that we summarized all of I think we've discussed most of these, but the key issues we would highlight really are, again, just to recap, adapting private sector guidance, the significant challenge that would be, as one of the KEG members suggested, not to underestimate that. And many respondents really challenged the many different aspects and facets of what is public sector specific. Some considered, there are linkages, like Mari suggested, to the private sector. There are sectors that are aligned, that are out there. There's health, education, commonly raised, that we may see in the public and the private sector. And so what is the scope of our work? And when we think about adapting private sector, if we take IPSASB, is it IPSASB and GRI, or how do we draw on what's out there and continue to monitor the progress in that space? And so ultimately a real challenge to clearly define and think about how we would adapt private sector guidance. And I think that ties into scope to some extent, really thinking as discussed about the scope and objectives, which will provide that direction and guidance as we move forward, if we move forward in developing such guidance. Authority of guidance, we touched on briefly, again, something for the board to consider whether they'll be mandatory or non-mandatory, and we'll certainly think about what terminology may be appropriate, since we don't actually mandate use of the standards, but really the level of authority and how they'll sit in our suite of standards. The conceptual framework we touched on, whether that needs to be revisited for sustainability or not, and think about that upfront. Priority topics. Certainly, I think we have agreement and support for general sustainability and climate related as first topics, but to sit back and consider if there's anything else, since constituents really had strong opinions about that as well. And then finally, the sustainability expertise, certainly that we are aware of and working towards. So we'll pause there.
Thanks for that, Ross. Sorry. Okay, well, do you want to make your comment anyway? So I'll go to Thomas.
Thanks. So it relates to the key enablers point that we just kind of went over, and the funding point in particular, that it was great to get the 70 comment letters feedback, and almost all of them were willing to contribute their comments and involvement in the process. But that's not going to drive this work on its own. So I did want to highlight our first committed support that we received was a little bit of seed funding for year one from the ACCA's Global Public Sector Group. And I wanted to acknowledge and thank them for committing some resources, because earlier we talked about PV2 and some concerns people have about our ability to do it. And a lot of the ability to address those concerns is going to come from new funders stepping up. And so far, it's been a pretty disappointing response in funders stepping up and committing resources to something that clearly is needed. So I just wanted to make that point that we're going to need a little bit better engagement from the funding community to get this off the ground if we're going to get the expertise we need to really do this right. We've had good support from our current funders in doing this, and it's clear we've got support from our constituents, but there will be needed some incremental funding to really get this moving. And I just wanted to make that call in this open session.
Thanks, Ross. And there are other discussions that are in progress. So it's not that there aren't other irons in the fire, but as you say, it's ACCA that have actually stepped up to the plate. We actually have an agreement signed with them. So thank you very much to them for showing leadership on that. Maybe I'll just go to Thomas and then to Camira.
Just two brief comments. First, kind of just want to repeat what I said earlier. When kind of CAG members looked at this list of key issues, they found them all important again, but they said probably what you need is a kind of a gradual approach to kind of approach them one after the other and focus first on scope and objective before touching on the other ones. Just want to throw into interesting remarks, which I kind of did not yet bring to the table, but I don't want them to be forgotten regarding authority of guidance. One member suggested that you could even think about having a phased approach, voluntary adoption first, then kind of a required adoption without audit, and then finally adoption with audit. So that doesn't need to be one final solution at the beginning. It might be kind of growing into that. And the last remark was, which I just found interesting, was that one member said, if the standards are properly developed, the issue of whether the standards are mandatory is a red herring. It's not really important. Do it right, and then everybody will jump on it. I think just want to mention that.
Thanks, Thomas. Camira.
Thanks, Chair. I think from these key issues, for me, I think the most important is the scope. So we need to define where are we going. And then once we have that, I think it will be much more easier to convince stakeholders to provide funding. Because as of now, it's okay, it's a very high level. We have a good response from the consultation paper, but now we need to go on the ground and say how we will operationalize that. And then the second more priority, as in my perspective, is the sustainability expertise. We also need to identify which activities, what are we going to do in order to close that gap, and also how much funding we need for that. So I think the more specific we are on those two aspects, will open the doors for more funding. Thanks.
Thank you, Camilla. So I've got Lucy and then Adrian.
As disclosed in the feedback to our CP, there are really a number of issues that have to be covered in sustainability reporting. And I agree with Camila that there is the issue of scope and materiality should first be identified, because there are numerous sustainability related issues in various government agencies that may be within the scope of our guidelines. Maybe we can capitalize on the report of the World Bank, and because they have started already with the sovereign climate and nature related issues. And in that report, they have presented already the information needs of our constituents, and even the reference to the available references that we can leverage on, and the specific responsible ministries whom we can approach for guidance, like for instance, environment and finance or agriculture or whatever. It would depend really on the coverage on the topic that we will first cover. So I think climate change related topic is really very much, then I think it would be the number one, it's a number one issue that is now being addressed by a number of public sector entities. So it would really depend on the topic that we will first cover. And I agree that in our CP we have already indicated that we might be going first with the climate related topics. And definitely, if this is already in the World Bank report, then we might get the support of World Bank to provide the resources and even the expertise we need for this project. Because with the varied, if we will cover all the 17 SDGs, that would be a big bang approach, and it would take us a number, maybe decades, before we can even come up with guidelines. So, but when we approach it by phase, like what we're doing also in our existing projects, we do not cover everything, but we have some focus. So maybe we can achieve something. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. And I think it's very helpful reminder about that World Bank report. I think there's a lot of good material in there that obviously that they first invited us into the space, but I think there's a lot of very good analysis across, from a diverse background that we should go back and have a look at now if we decide to move forward. Adrian and then Ajith.
I have a few comments on the key issues. Well, I will not rephrase what's been said up to now on authoritative guidance, etc., because I fully concur with what has been said. I also support the idea that scope and objectives are probably, of course, and we all agree on that, the first issues that we should address. Going back to adapting private sector guidance, in my mind, reading that and hearing of the responses, I linked that to my reaction to the previous slides where it was displayed the main concerns, the climate, environment, etc. And also I thought about one of my reflection about the possible confusion or ambiguity in the responses, and that I hope we will not introduce in our thinking between the different areas of concern. As SDGs, people very often make confusions with SDGs, ESGs, etc. SDGs, the 17 SDGs are for central government. It's a set of commitments by nations. Okay, it probably doesn't apply or doesn't ring a bell to local governments, local or national government autonomous bodies, whereas ESGs, be them for private or public sector, really ring bells for people. So social, environmental, governance, it really should be probably the most, I mean, the area that would provide the most of the possible traction to develop standards in the public sector. Adapting private sector guidance means that also we are able to develop something that would more or less look like a taxonomy that they have in the private sector, or developed in the private sector. Could be also based on what GRI has developed. I mean, they have developed some sort of a taxonomy throughout the set of standards. I don't know perfectly the set of standards of GRI, but if I remember well, it's rather broken down for different subsectors, etc. So this is also something that we should have to think about when developing the scope of our project. Might not be as difficult as we think, Thomas, but not so easy, but not as difficult as we believe. There is a possible breakdown of public sector activities that we could, at the very beginning, try to work on. Okay. About conceptual framework, something came to my mind, that I think also that there are many entry points in the conceptual framework for sustainable reporting thinking. Many. And specifically in the very beginning of the qualitative characteristics of financial reporting, there could be links between those characteristics and a possible authoritative or non-authoritative requirement for reporting and sustainability.
Thanks, Elliot. So Ajith next.
Thanks, Chris. I think I agree with Kamira when she said that the scope, our ability to get funding will depend on the scope. I think that might be a key factor to consider when we are drafting the scope, because depending on the scope, many people will either provide funds or not provide funds, depending on the level of on the scope. So maybe we may be probably reluctant to go for a full jurisdiction level looking at the public sector responsibility in relation to both the private sector and the public sector at the beginning. Probably we may not have the capacity to adhere to that, but I think if we go for a phased approach, and that phased approach is identified initially, then we might be able to probably enable ourselves to get funding better, in order to so that people will know that in the future, the next stage will be that we will go for a further, more than what the private sector is doing. But initially, we probably start with what we are doing with the private sector. But to go further, we are planning to go further, and then that will enable us to help to get more funding in relation to public sector related activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajith. Okay, any other points, Celine? I think we're there on the analysis. Okay, so I think that's been really helpful, a very good foundation for the strategic session that the board will move into after the lunch break. So I think with that, we break for lunch for an hour. So that is the end of the public session for today. If board members can come back in an hour's time, we will move into the strategy session. And then in terms of public session, we will reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning when we move into the item on transfer expenses and revenue. So thanks very much, everyone, and see the board members back in an hour's time. And lunch is now available. I saw a thumbs up. Well, so lunch is available now. Thank you.